Well, thank you, and thank you all for turning out. We're going to experiment and see if I project loudly enough without a microphone. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, so if I drift to a quieter mode and you can't hear, Lauren will turn the microphone on again. Well, that was a very flattering introduction, and you may wonder from that particular accounting of my areas of specialization, what the heck I'm doing here, lecturing to you about Zionism. I've had the pleasure of having the same partner for 50 years, and she happens to be a Jewish historian. So most of our dinner conversation revolves around the intersection of philosophy and Jewish history. And so any erudition that I appear to display with regard to Jewish history is due to my wife, Deborah Hertz. Let me begin by offering you my credo when it comes to philosophy, because we're actually going to do philosophy together today. We have quite a lot to cover in the 40 minutes I've been allotted to speak, and I want you to get a chance to participate in the discussion afterwards. But I think it's important in framing what we're doing here to talk to you a little bit about what it is to do philosophy in the way that I do it, because I think philosophy actually involves 90% of the work in philosophy is figuring out the right question to ask. If you don't have the right question, then you're really doomed from the outset. And my credo is really drawn from Bertrand Russell, the famous British 19th century philosopher. He writes, in philosophy, the first difficulty is to see that the problem is difficult. If you say to a person untrained in philosophy, how do you know I have two eyes? He or she will reply, what a silly question. I can see you have. It's not to be supposed that when our inquiry is finished, we shall have arrived at anything radically different from this unphilosophical position. What will have happened is that we will have come to see a complicated structure where we thought everything was simple, that we will have become aware of the penumbra of uncertainty surrounding situations which inspire no doubt, that we shall find doubt more frequently justified than we supposed, and that even the most plausible premises will have been shown themselves to be capable of yielding implausible conclusions. The net result is to substitute articulate hesitation for inarticulate certainty. That's from Bertrand Russell, an inquiry into meaning and truth. So today I want to apply this argument to the asserted identity between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. That identity gives rise to the following proposal. We all know anti-Semitism is bad, so anti-Zionism is bad because they're identical with each other. Now, I think anti-Zionism is bad. I am a Zionist, but I also reject the identity between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think it's an intellectually dishonest way to rely on anti-Semitism and the alleged identity between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to defend Zionism. So today I want to show you why anti-Zionism is not identical with anti-Semitism. And nonetheless, I want to try and justify Zionism for you. This is an old philosophical trick. You concede the position to your opponent, and then you do a jujitsu movement to say, even though I've conceded, nonetheless, I'm going to defeat your argument. Most famous example in 20th century philosophy, A Defense of Abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson, who says to people, I will concede that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, if you want, and nonetheless, I will show you that there's a justifiable position that women have a right of choice, even if the fetus is a person. So it's irrelevant to argue that position. All right, so off we go. I need, for the purposes of this argument, to assert, as simply a matter of assertion, some definitions, two definitions that I need, one of Zionism and one of anti-Semitism. And for the purposes of argument, I'm actually going to ask you to accept those definitions. They're not controversial definitions, but you can treat this as if you don't agree with it, as a sort of hypothetical argument. If I accept these definitions, is what he's saying correct? Does it actually follow? So I'm using Zionism in the sense of I filched this from somewhere, I don't remember where, a movement for originally the reestablishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. So that's the position I'm using. Now, just for background, let me point out that that is actually one of a number of different versions of Zionism that were contemporaneous to Herzl's account of Zionism in the 19th century. For example, there's a version of religious Zionism that starts in 1850, promulgated by Eastern European rabbis. They believed in the religious return to Jerusalem, but they did not believe in the state or a nation. There's a version of 1880 by early Russian Zionists who believed in principle that Jews should return to what was then Palestine to work the land, but they had no conception of a state. And there's a version of Zionism from 1900, Poletzion, which is a form of labor Zionism as a Hebrew autonomous wing of an international socialist movement that is explicitly anti-statist in conception. We're not using those competing versions. We're using the dominant version, which is a statist version, Herzl's version. And by the way, Herzl's versions of a nation state has no religious connotations to it whatsoever. Anti-Semitism, this is more straightforward. I'm simply going to treat anti-Semitism as hostility to or prejudice against Jewish people. Not necessarily the Jewish people, but Jewish people. There's another version of it that expands on that. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance defines anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jews and their property, towards Jewish communities, institutions, and religious facilities. So those are pretty uncontroversial definitions, and I'll ask you to accept those for the purposes of argument. So first step, given these two definitions that I've just given you of Herzl Zionism, what I'll call political Zionism, and traditional anti-Semitism, prima facie, on the face of it, conceptually, there's a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism opposes the founding of a Jewish state. Anti-Semitism has these connotations of hatred towards Jews. They're not identical to each other semantically, to be pedantic about it, in terms of the meaning of the words. And so the connection of them has to be established if you want to say anti-Zionism is intrinsically a form of anti-Semitism. So you might argue, with regard to trying to forge that identity, that the following are the case. And because the following are the case, they make for this identity between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. First, those who promote anti-Semitism are motivated by anti-Semitism. Second, the goal of promoting anti-Zionism is to target Jews in virtue of their being Jews. Or third, Jews experience anti-Semitism as an attack on their Jewishness. So the first of all, just to repeat them because you need to keep these in mind, the first is anti-Zionism is motivated by anti-Semitism. The second is the goal of anti-Zionism is to target Jews. And the third is a psychological argument that Jews experience anti-Semitism as Jews experience anti-Zionism as an attack on their Jewishness, and hence as a form of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, excuse me. Sorry. Final version, Zionism has functionally become part of Judaism in the last 100 years. It's just part and parcel of the nature of Judaism. So, even though I am a Zionist, I reject all four of these claims, and I'm going to now give you the arguments as to why I reject them. So in case you're getting anxious, I am going to circle after I've knocked down all these arguments and give you a defense of Zionism. So unless you happen to be an anti-Zionist, in which case you'll be disappointed, if you're a Zionist, you can relax and just try and follow the argument. Of course, you may be an a-Zionist, but let's not worry about being pedantic about that. Okay. So I think any account of the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has, I think, to make room for Jewish anti-Zionists without treating them as anti-Semitic. I take this as a reasonable position to take. If there is a Jewish person who is an anti-Zionist, I don't think it can plausibly follow in every case that therefore that Jewish person is anti-Semitic, or if you will, a self-hating Jew. And the reason I think that is a number of reasons. Historically, anti-Zionism, as we conceive of Zionism today, Herzl-type Zionism, was a position held by many Jews who were not self-hating before the founding of the state. And I've just given you all of these versions of anti-Zionism that were promoted in the 19th century and 20th century that are at variance with Herzl-type Zionism. But beyond that, there were, have been, and still are today, prominent, serious Jewish thinkers who were anti-Zionist. I think the most famous of them is Martin Buber. Martin Buber founded Brit Shalom, which was an organization that aimed to bring Jews and Arabs in what was then Palestine together as culturally autonomous peoples that would live together and build a country together. It was a form, in a way, it was a kind of federation notion. You'd have the Jewish people, you'd have the Palestinian people or the Arab people. They would live in one country, they would build a country together, but they would each have autonomous institutions on their own. And I challenge any of you who want to do it, try and take it on, to try and make the argument that Martin Buber is an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. He just had a different conception about how that area should be developed and how a home for Jews should be built. In 1942, the American Council for Judaism argued that Judaism, and that was made up of rabbis primarily, Judaism is a religion of universal values and not a nationality. They argued that nationality and religion are separate and distinct, and that Israel is the homeland of its own citizens only and not the homeland of all Jews. And they were very aggressive in promulgating this idea against the founding of the state, not against the founding of the state, but against the claim that the founding of the state was the state of all of the Jewish people. Today, even though I think they're crazy, we have organizations like Neturei Karta and Satmar Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are aggressively anti-Zionist because they argue it is wrong to form the nation of Israel, nation of the Jewish people, before the arrival of the Messiah. And Neturei Karta was extremely activist in dealing with the Palestinians. The Satmar are not that way, but they are avowedly anti-Zionist. And again, I think it's implausible for all of my frustration with them, let's put it that way, to put it politely. I would never claim that they're anti-Semites. I think they're just profoundly misguided. It's undoubtedly true that some, maybe many, if you wish, I don't think most, but maybe many, are anti-Zionists are motivated by anti-Semitism. But I see no basis, in fact, to say that's true of all anti-Zionists. For example, Palestinians who favor a democratic secular state made up of all of its citizens, including Jews, are not, I think, therefore anti-Semitic in promoting anti-Zionism. Some of them may, but I don't think all of them are, and I know some of them. Or anti-nationalists for whom anti-Zionism is an instance, or those who disfavor ethnically exclusionary states, including Jewish Israelis I know, who have fought in the army and vote for parties that are not Zionist in nature. So that's the first argument I want to make, or the first consideration I want to make. If you will, if you start off saying all anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, all I have to do is give you one counterexample that you can't respond to, and your universal generalization that all anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic is defeated. I've given you a whole bunch of them. Now, your job, if you were doing philosophy, your job is not to attack me personally. Your job is to show me my argument is flawed, that the step in the argument is flawed, and that you can, in fact, sustain the claim that all anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic. What about promoting anti-Zionism to target Jews qua Jews? I think that's just a version of anti-Semitism. So all of the arguments I've given against the identity of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism hold against the claim that anti-Zionism is just a way of targeting Jews. Not all anti-Zionists are targeting Jews. Some anti-Zionists who are anti-Semitic are targeting Jews. There's no doubt about that in my mind. See it among some Palestinians I know. You see it among people from a bunch of different nations, including England, where I grew up today, and certainly in the United States among the right wing. But I don't think that's the dominant view. A much more interesting argument is that many Jews, particularly younger Jews that I know at UCSD that my wife teaches, have come to embrace Zionism as part of their Jewish identity. And therefore they experience assertions of anti-Zionism as an attack on their Jewishness. It makes them feel uncomfortable. It makes them feel self-conscious. It makes them feel excluded, and they find it very unpleasant. But it doesn't follow, even if all of that is the case, it doesn't follow, therefore, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, because someone has embraced Zionism as part of their Jewish identity. Any more, I think, that if you oppose a Palestinian state, it makes you prejudiced against Palestinians, even if the idea of statehood was something some Palestinians took to be intrinsic to their sense of what it is to be Palestinian. I'm giving you a counterexample. If you believe that this psychological state of embracing Zionism as part of a person's Jewish identity is good grounds for saying someone who opposes Zionism is anti-Semitic, then you have to apply the same position consistently across different positions, non-Jewish positions, like a Palestinian who says, Palestinian nationhood is an intrinsic part of my identity. So when you are opposed to a Palestinian state, you're discriminating against me as a Palestinian. What about the argument that Zionism has become a functional part of Judaism as opposed to a matter of individual identity? What should we say about that? Is it plausible to say that if Zionism has become a functional part of Judaism, and I'm not sure it has, but I'm open to the argument that it has, although then you have the problem of people who are very serious Jews who are not Zionists. I mean, if you go to Philadelphia, Philadelphia is a hotbed of incredibly serious young Jews, many of whom are quite alienated from the central doctrines of Zionism. But suppose that is the case. Suppose we concede that Zionism has become a functional part of Judaism, not as a matter of identity of the individual, but as it were of Judaism as a whole. Again, apply this doctrine to Palestinianism and see if you can sustain the view consistently. I think it would be fair to say in this second case, well, you may think to a Palestinian, you may think that Palestinian statehood is part and parcel of Palestinianism, but that does not in itself mean the rest of the world has to agree with you. You can think whatever you like, doesn't mean all of us have to agree with you. Here's a more contentious claim. A Mormon, the proponent of some Mormon faction in Utah comes to you and says polygamy is a central feature of what it is to be a Mormon. So when you oppose polygamy, you're discriminating against me as a Mormon. We can say, no, we don't think polygamy is correct, socially speaking. We don't dislike you individually. We dislike this part of your doctrine. Or even more wildly, suppose, as there are in parts of Nigeria and other parts of West Africa, there are cultural groups that believe in clitorectomy. And they come to you and say, clitorectomy is a central part of our culture. So when you oppose clitorectomy in young women, you are discriminating against our culture. I think we're perfectly within our rights to say, no, we respect you as individuals. We even respect your culture, but we don't respect this aspect of your culture. And there's no reason for us to go along with it just because you assert it's a central part of your culture. I think that Zionism should be defended on its own terms, not by reliance on the identity between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I don't want to argue that being an anti-Zionist is tied intimately to this idea of being an anti-Semite. And so I want to consider arguments for Zionism that bracket this whole discussion of anti-Semitism. And I want to begin actually by examining what I think is an interestingly bad argument, because it's the argument that most people give to defend Zionism. And the argument is this: all people have a right to a state, so why not Jews? Every other people has a state, so why not Jews? You don't oppose other people having a state, and suddenly you're opposing us, so you're discriminating against us. I think this is an interestingly bad argument because it starts with a false premise. Not every people has a state, and I'm going to assert it's not clear that every people has a right to a state. I mean, certainly, if you hold to this view, all people have a state except, you're saying all people have a right to a state except Jews, so you're discriminating against Jews, that will come as incredibly good news to the Kurds, the people of Wales, the people of Scotland, and of course, the Palestinians. So if you're going to be a consistent person in terms of your universal right that all peoples have a right to a state, I expect you to go out of here and not only trumpet the right of Jews to have a state, but the trumpet of the Kurds, the Welsh, the Scotch, and the Palestinians. Actually, while you're at it, this morning I couldn't sleep. I was so excited to come and talk to you that I Googled, where the hell did I put it? I Googled how many proto-states there are. Just for the A's, there is the Adigir in Russia, the Eland in Finland, the Altai in Russia, the Ashanti in Ghana, the Assad in Pakistan, and the Azores in Portugal, all of whom claim to be people. And so you better go out and agitate for them. And then, because I was really bored and couldn't sleep at about 3 in the morning, I thought, how many peoples are there in England that are agitating for the state? I never realized that. There's the Cornish people. They have the Cornish, the Cornish people. There's the Shetland people, the people of Shetland. There's the people of Yorkshire. There's the people of Wessex, the Manx people of the Isle of Man. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Surely, if we think that everyone has a right to a state, every people, then so do these as well. Well, I think this principle, even if you could waive it and say every people has a right to a state, is an incredibly bad idea as a matter of political science, because to marry ethnically pure states with the accoutrements of nationhood, as in an army, means that not only do you have units of people with lethal weapons at their disposal, but they're organized in nation states, which encourages the idea of not just verbal conflict, but aggressive conflict with each other. I mean, it seems to me the great accomplishment of the European Union was to remove Germany in large part from its national identity and begin to transfer it to a larger identity of 28 people. And despite what's going on in Ukraine and despite what was going on in Yugoslavia, neither of which were part of the European Union at the time, it's been an astonishingly successful enterprise to stop a reoccurrence of the horrors of European racism. Well, not European racism, but European violence arising from racism. Well, even if you disagree with me, you might still hold to the view that every people has a right, and maybe maybe if you are a stubborn philosopher, you'll say, fine, I'll take all that. I'll go and argue for all these people. They won't get nation state in any case, but I can say I'm for it just to satisfy him. So now I'm going to get sort of down and dirty philosophically and ask just where this right comes from. When you say every people has a right, what is this right? Where does it come from? Now, we live in a period, I think, of extreme promiscuity when it comes to rights, beginning in the late 1940s with the establishment of the United Nations, which asserted a whole shopping list of rights that people have. The right, and it's become, from a philosophical point of view, a reductio ad absurdum. It's not only the case that people have a right to food and they have a right to a shelter, but and a right to sexual freedom, but they also have a right to a good life. And the reason most philosophers, including me, are very leery about this promiscuity is that we think that this account of rights is very mysterious and very hard to justify. The theory of rights in the philosophical tradition that I work in, which I guess goes back to the ancient Greeks, is really a theory of what philosophers call a theory of negative rights, the kind of rights that occur in the Bill of Rights in the United States. They basically place you under a duty not to interfere with other people, not to interfere with other people as far as their freedom of speech is concerned, not to interfere with other people in terms of their freedom of movement, not to interfere with the people by murdering them, for example. But what's interesting about this account of rights is that it doesn't oblige you to do things that involve helping someone as opposed to not interfering with someone. You're on the beach, you're under a constraint not to drown people. Okay, you're on the beach and you see a 5-year-old drowning in 3 inches of water. It would be really nice if you went out and saved them. But if you don't save them, people may say you're an absolute bastard, but they're not going to, as it were, indict you for a criminal offense. You've done something wrong, but the nature of the wrongness of it is actually very, very hard to specify, because we, particularly in the United States, with our libertarian kinds of orientation, don't live in a society in which we take as a moral obligation to act to help someone. We take as a moral obligation not to hurt someone, not to interfere with their freedom, but not necessarily help them. It may be good to help them, it may be kind to help them, but you're not under a moral obligation to help them. And I think this is a 40-minute lecture that I'm not going to give you now. I think one can give a coherent defense of negative rights and where they come from. Why are they rational for us all to sign up on? And I think it is much, much harder to give an account of what philosophers call positive rights. The idea that every people has a right to a state is a positive state, is a positive right. And I'm not playing naive here. I actually don't know where that positive right comes from. And I've also said that I'm not clear it's in the interests from a peace point of view to promulgate national rights for every people. Now to the more controversial claim I'm going to make, which the phrase is, every people has a right to a state. I've questioned the notion of rights. Now I'm going to go one step further and ask you what it means to be a people. I always get into trouble when I say this at dinner parties because I mix in relatively progressive circles. I assert that the Palestinians were not a people until sometime between 1880 and 1920. That the peoplehood of Palestinians was actually constructed in response to the Jewish settlement or resettlement of the area of Palestine, that the people living there were a mix, some of whom looked to what is now Syria, some of whom looked to Egypt. They were dominated by the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't have what you would call a coherent national self-identity as a people until it was built in reaction to, well, two things. One, the Jewish settlement, and also in the 1920s, the establishment of Egyptian nationalism. There was really, to the extent there was any nationalism, it was pan-Arab nationalism, but in the 1920s, Egypt actually established a notion of an Egyptian nationalism. And partly, I think Palestinian nationalism was developed in response to that. Okay, now you're feeling very smug, probably. I think I think the same, by the way, is true of Ukrainians. There is no Ukraine as a distinct national culture until basically, I think, I wish my wife was here to check on this, I believe the middle of the 19th century. All right, so now you're really, really smug, and I'm going to assert the following, which will annoy some of you. I think the same actually is true of Jewish nationalism. I think Jewish nationalism has a much more recent provenance than we like to think. I think Jewish nationalism, particularly as it's promulgated by Herzl and the political Zionists, arises in the 19th century. It arises in the 19th century in response to a movement across Eastern Europe, which is very different from Western Europe. In Western Europe, the response to the French Revolution and the Enlightenment was the idea of secular states. France in the 19th century and earlier 20th century became the most successful state in Europe in turning foreigners into French people. Vast majority of French people today had at least one grandfather, actually in the 1920s, had at least one grandparent who was not French. It was the most successful in transforming people into being French. In Eastern Europe, the response to the Enlightenment or the resistance to the Enlightenment was totally different. It was actually a movement towards establishing national countries with national identities and ethnically coherent people. And Judaism, as a movement for a people with a state, arose in an atmosphere in which many different ethnicities were agitating for exactly the same outcome. Now, you're saying, no doubt, well, wait a minute, what about the history of the Jewish people on all I've learned? Look, I'm on relatively shaky ground, but I'm reasonably confident, at least from breakfast this morning with my wife. I'm actually a philosopher of history as well, and I think one of the things that we do historically is that we rewrite history to pick up landmarks to fit into our presentist account. So we very much have inherited this 19th century notion that we've grown up with of the Jews are a people with a sense of peoplehood, the Jews are a nation, and under Herzl they were a nation looking for a physical place to establish that nation, but they were a nation in the conceptual sense. I think that's definitely true in the 19th century. I think if you look back to before the Christian era, it becomes a much more complicated question. My own view is that you need to look at this from the point of view of what you might call the phenomenology of the individual, the experience of the individual. How do they think of themselves? You know, it comes as a shock to realize that until the French Revolution, only people around Paris thought of themselves as French. People living in areas of what we now call France, outside Paris, didn't really think of themselves as French. In Italy, it wasn't until the revolution in the 19th century, and by the way, the establishment of national newspapers, that people in what we call different areas of Italy thought of themselves as Italian. They didn't. But the Italian nationalists did a revisionist history to, in a sense, rewrite history to make that the case. We see this all over the place. So at least I ask you to entertain that. It's not crucial to my argument that you embrace this, but I ask you to think about it because I think it has actually it's an important equalizer. And even if you don't agree with me, the argument I also want you to consider is that I don't think that peoplehood or the idea of we, whoever we are, whether we are the Jewish people or the Ukrainian people, is what philosophers call a natural category. It's not like gold that has a particular atomic structure. These are cultural constructions, just like race is a cultural construction that we build as a culture to define the features of it. And I think that every people, whether you think Jews did it 70 Christian era or 19th century, every people has a history in which this construction takes place. And people begin to think of themselves as not isolated individuals or not isolated individuals with a religion, but part of a much greater whole. So I think that either way, I think the argument that every other people has a nation, so why not Jews? If you oppose a nation for the Jews, then you're discriminating against Jews. I think that is a bad argument. I don't think it's true that every people has a nation. I don't think it's even true that every people has a right to a nation. I'm unclear, even if they did, what that right comes down to, because I don't have an account of positive rights. And finally, I think the notion of peoplehood is in fact a pretty squishy notion that we ought to try and get clear on before we appropriate ourselves the role to say that all peoples have rights to states. Okay, so I'm done with what you might call the negative part of this presentation. So having done all of that, now I'm going to tell you why I'm a Zionist. And the version of Zionism I'm going to give you is actually not original to me. It's actually comes from a very, very brilliant Israeli historian who just died, I think, last year, Zev Sternhell, who I think was the most thoughtful person on this front. And the version of Zionism I'm going to give you is not going to satisfy all of you because it's not as robust as you might like. But I've just given you 40 minutes of argument to try and show you you shouldn't be, to echo Bertrand Russell, so sort of confident at the outset that you're trafficking in a robust notion. I think that Zionism arose, I'm echoing Sternhell here, I think Zionism arose as an imperative because of the Holocaust. My family left Vienna when the Nazis invaded in 1938. They were affluent enough that they didn't, only one of them ended up in a labor camp and only one of them was shot in a concentration camp. But the rest, which were numerous in number, were wealthy and well-connected enough that they went to England, to Switzerland, to Uruguay, to the United States, and were able to establish their life relatively straightforwardly. But obviously for the vast majority of Jews, that was not the case. In particular, for the survivors of the Holocaust, whether they were coming out of camps or whether they had escaped and lived hidden lives, to go back to where they had come from, particularly in Poland, and face now the ongoing attacks upon their return was an imperative that needed to be responded to. And Sternhell's argument is, that was a moral imperative afterwards. And so the state was a necessity there. The state may not have been a necessity before then. I mean, some of you will say, well, what about the pogroms in Russia and in Poland in the 19th century? Maybe. I'm willing to consider that as an objection to the argument. But his argument was it really arose in response to the imperative to deal with millions of people in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And we should not understand it as an absolute argument. We should understand it as a contingent historical necessity. And you don't have to accept this consequence of it. And Sternhell said, well, the people living there had to pay the price for it. And he argued we should accept that there is a certain obligation we have to those people because the inhabitants, whether you call them Palestinians or not, they had to pay the price of displacement for this contingent necessity to be realized. And so we have some kind of obligation or duty towards them. I don't care if you accept that for the purposes of argument. The argument I want to convince you of is that the Zionism that is a plausible Zionism, in my view, that I at least feel I can defend against all of my skepticism about peoplehood, about rights, about nation states, and all of ethnically pure states, is really the result of history. Now, why Israel? Well, you'll remember, those of you who have read Herzl and know the history of the Zionist Congress and the Fifth Zionist Congress, is that he supports the idea, he raises the idea of Uganda rather than Israel, because as I said to you in the beginning, Herzl Zionism is not religious, it's not messianic, it's got nothing to do with returning to the origins. It has to do with establishing a safe space for Jews. And if not Israel, why not Uganda? I have a counter thesis, which I have raised numerous times at the dinner table and been laughed at by my wife. And I'm going to try it on you. Not Israel, not Uganda, Bavaria. They did it. Why the hell shouldn't they bear the price? They should have kicked out all of the Bavarians, cleared the land, and establish the state in Bavaria. That's the piece. Thank you. I'll take your questions.